It started with a simple 911 call, a voice filled with panic, confusion, and fear that should have led to immediate answers, but instead became the beginning of one of the most bizarre and disturbing mysteries
in American true crime history, because on the night of January 31st, 2008, in Orlando, a young woman
over what really happened. Because at the center of it all was a 2-year-old girl
who had been missing for 31 days before anyone even called the police. And that single fact changes everything.
Because when a child disappears, every second matters, every minute counts, and yet in this case, there was nothing. An entire month passed in silence. No report, no search, no urgency. Just a gap in time that investigators would later struggle to understand, so stay with me. Because as we go deeper into this case, you'll begin to see how every detail, every statement, every contradiction builds a story that is as confusing as it is chilling. And by the end, you might find yourself asking the same question that has haunted this case from the very beginning. The timeline begins with what seems like an ordinary family life.
From the outside, the Miller household appeared completely normal. But as investigators would later discover, appearances can be deceiving.
Appearances can be deceiving because behind that normal exterior were inconsistencies, behaviors, and decisions that didn't align with what you would expect in a situation like this. When he finally reported her daughter missing,
her statements immediately raised questions. She claimed that a nanny had taken Caylee, a person who, upon investigation, didn't exist.
She provided names, details, locations, all of which led nowhere. And as each lead collapsed, the credibility of her story collapsed with it. It began to unravel. Because when someone is truly searching for a missing child, their focus is on finding answers, not creating confusion. And yet confusion is exactly what investigators encountered at every step. The deeper they looked, the more inconsistencies they found. Casey's behavior during those 31 days became a focal point. Because instead of searching,
instead of reporting, she was seen going out, socializing, living life as if nothing had happened.
And that disconnect between her actions and the situation raised serious concerns, because it suggests either a level of denial that is difficult to comprehend, or knowledge of something that hadn't yet been revealed. And that's where the case takes a darker turn. And eventually, that fear was confirmed.
When remains were discovered in a wooded area not far from the family home. And in that moment,
the case shifted from a missing person investigation to something far more serious. Because now the question wasn't just, where is Caylee, but what happened to her, and who was responsible? Investigators began reconstructing the timeline, analyzing evidence. I'm looking at forensic details, trying to piece together what occurred during those missing 31 days.
And what they found only added to the complexity. And there were signs that something had been concealed.
Evidence that suggested attempts to hide what had happened, and yet, despite all of this, the case was far from straightforward. Because every piece of evidence seemed to raise as many questions as it answered. And that's what makes this case so unique. It's because it isn't just about what happened, it's about what can be proven, what can be explained, and what remains uncertain.
The trial that followed became one of the most widely watched in the country, with millions of people following every detail.
Every testimony, every argument, because everyone wanted to understand how a case with so many suspicious elements. The prosecution presented their version of events, suggesting that Caylee's death was not accidental, even though there was still room for doubt. I saw something that had been covered up. Meanwhile, the defense offered a completely different narrative, one that challenged the assumptions, questioned the evidence, and introduced alternative explanations that complicated the story even further. And this is where the case becomes even more unsettling, because it highlights the gap between suspicion and proof, between what seems likely and what can be definitively established. And as the trial progressed, that gap became the central focus, because in the absence of clear, undeniable evidence, the truth becomes harder to define. And when the verdict was finally delivered,
it shocked the world because it didn't align with what many people expected. It didn't provide the closure
that so many were looking for. Instead, it left behind a sense of unresolved tension, a feeling that despite everything that had been presented, the full story had not been uncovered. And that's why this case continues to be discussed, debated, analyzed, because it challenges our understanding of justice, of truth, and of how we interpret the actions of others. The theories surrounding what happened to Caylee Anthony are numerous. Some believe it was a tragic accident and ultimately concealed. Others believe it was something more deliberate, something that involved intent and planning. And then there are those who believe that the truth lies somewhere in between, that the reality is more complicated than any single narrative can fully capture. And that's perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all, because it means that even with all the information available, even with years of investigation and analysis, we may still not fully understand what happened. And as you think about this case, consider how easily perception can shape reality, how the way we interpret behavior, evidence, and statements can influence our conclusions. Because in the end, this isn't just a story about a missing child. It's a story about the shadows we can't pierce, about limits, and the echoes of unanswered questions that remain. And as we reach the end, one question still lingers. The same question that has been asked since the beginning. What really happened during those 31 days? Because somewhere within that gap lies the truth, a truth that has yet to be fully revealed. And until it is, this case will remain one of the most controversial and haunting mysteries. The search for answers often leads to more questions. Some mysteries, though, remain forever unsolved.
And sometimes, the truth is far more complex than we're prepared to accept.